Thank you so much for joining Forge Breast Cancer Survivor Center for our coffee conversations. Today we have Emily Wells with us, and we are going to talk about grief and breast cancer and the holidays and how to navigate those different things. So thank you so much for joining us today, Emily.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I am a clinical social worker. I work at Oasis Counseling for Women and Children and providing therapy to adult women. I've been here at Oasis for about a year and a half. And prior to that, my career as a social worker was in the medical setting. So doing a lot with caregivers, patients, families, and that is really still where my passion and interest is working with people who are sick and their families.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's so needed, especially like the family aspect of it, because we're all going through life together. What I love about this topic today is that we're going to really be talking about the different types of grief. What does grief look like? What is grief? Oftentimes people might identify grief as just sadness and it's dark gloom. And, there are little details that go into what makes grief. So I think that this topic is going to be really helpful to discuss. So what is grief? And do you ever get over it? Is there ever a period in grief where you say, okay, I'm done?
So as I was preparing for this, I said, well, I want to Google grief and see what comes up if I just Google the word grief or the term what is grief, right? So lots of things came up, like Merriam-Webster was like deep sorrow, profound sadness, like kinds of things that we may typically think of when we think of grief. But I also found a really awesome definition or overview of grief from the Mayo Clinic. And I'm just going to read part of that. So grief is a strong and sometimes overwhelming emotion for people, regardless of whether their sadness stems from the loss of a loved one or from a diagnosis that they or someone they love have received, or from other things, right? You may grieve a relationship if you break up or have a divorce, or obviously grieving a pet, or grieving what you wish had been, right? So grief is very natural. It's an independent, individual experience and also a universal experience. Every single person that you meet is grieving something, right? Maybe it is a loss in the traditional sense, or maybe it's something different. Yeah, it's very personal, and it's a reaction to any kind of loss. And no, we don't ever get over grief. Shanitha and I were actually discussing this morning, like your response to your grief may change over time. The way that you handle things may change. The things that cause you to grieve may change. But it's very circular process, right? Things are always going to come around and press on that old wound, right? You have this wound of grief and that doesn't go away, and like an additional bruise. So no, I don't think it ever goes away.
I like your realistic response.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, like if somebody loses a loved one or there's a major change in their life and they go through this period of sadness, you oftentimes might hear when is this going to get better? When am I going to be done with this? When am I going to be done crying? When am I going to be done being angry? When am I going to stop just feeling sadness and all of this sorrow? And I love that you point out it's a circular motion. You deal with it differently as you go throughout life because the event doesn't change.
Right.
That loss is still there. You're still going to miss your mother or your father or somebody close to you or your pet or whatever it is that you've lost. That doesn't actually change, but the way that you deal with it changes. So I like that can you talk a little bit about the cycles of grief?
Yeah, when people think of grief, or well, first of all, to touch on what you just said, people come to me, right, for grief, and they're like, when is it going to be better? When am I going to be myself again? Everybody wants to know that. And I don't know that you ever go back to yourself, right? What, like yourself before you lost that person or before you got this diagnosis. So we have to figure out how can we deal with that and change and move forward. So we have, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has the stages of grief, anger, denial, things like that. And some people expect to like go through those motions and then be done and for their grief process to be finished. And I think you kind of bounce back through all of those things all the time, right? When something, some sort of event, the holidays, a birthday, an anniversary, or even just, something you want to tell someone about. When those things come around and you're like, man, I really wish that so-and-so was here, right? I wish that they could have been here to see this event. Then that cycle kind of starts over, right? They're not here. So it just, every time there's an event, it presses on that wound, and we have to kind of address with ourselves, what does our grieving process look like as we move on?
So in saying that, oftentimes we feel different things in grief, anger, sadness, sometimes anxiety, fear of change and just never being able to experience certain things again. Why is it so important to acknowledge your pain or those emotions when you are experiencing grief?
Yeah, I think acknowledging it helps us to accept it, right? If we can say, yes, I am feeling this way, that helps us to accept that this is the reality and this is what happens. And that is okay, right? It's very important to hold two things to be true at the same time, right? I've gotten this diagnosis, I've lost my mother, or this is changing and this is hard for me. And at the same time, I still have this really beautiful life and these things that I can do and contribute to. So helping us to move forward and experience grief at the same time.
Thank you so much. So is it normal or is it common to experience grief in the holidays, even though these things occurred? So I know we've talked about, pressing on those old wounds, but oftentimes one may have the idea that, okay, this holiday is about joy, happiness, and all of these other different things. Why in the world am I feeling sad? This is when I'm supposed to be the most happy. I'm around all of my friends and all of my family, but I've got this diagnosis and I'm sad. You know, is that a normal thing for individuals to kind of experience around the holidays?
Oh, absolutely. I think the holidays are kind of a natural time. Yes, they're joyful, but they're also a natural time of reflecting, right? Like, we'll talk about, remember last Christmas, or when we were a kid, we always did this at Thanksgiving, right? It's kind of like a way to look back and reflect. And so when you're looking back and you're reflecting, you may say, last Christmas, I didn't have this diagnosis. Last Christmas, my mom was here with me. So I think it's natural to experience lots of different feelings around the holidays as we're reflecting on changes over the years, right? And there can be good changes too. Last Christmas you didn't have your grandbaby. Now you have a grandbaby and you see your family growing and changing, or you notice who is at the holiday events this year that wasn't last year, or who was here last year that's not this year. So it's a very natural time to kind of process all of the different things. And with a breast cancer diagnosis or any other diagnosis that's new during the holidays, or maybe the holidays are the first time you've been around a lot of people since then, there's definitely some anxiety and apprehension of what is it going to be like this year? How can I handle things?
Thank you so much. And I know we touched on this a little bit earlier about going back to a normal self um, after you think that grief is supposed to be over. But in specific, for those individuals who are experiencing a breast cancer diagnosis or just going through changes as they've been diagnosed, they might be grieving other different things. So not necessarily loss of a person, but loss of sense of self, especially as our body goes through so many different changes, surgeries, and all of these different things. Is it normal to feel or to grieve self, like feeling like they're losing themselves? And how do they cope with that loss or that change that they might be feeling in their grief process?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely normal. Some clients that I've worked with before, we've talked about loss of identity, right? When you have this new diagnosis, maybe you're losing your identity as someone in the workforce. Maybe you can't work anymore, and that has changed for you. Or your role as a mother or sister or family member, that changes. Now people are having to care for you where maybe you were the caregiver before. So those are some changes in role and identity. Some people struggle with a loss of their femininity, right? Depending on what kind of treatment that they have to receive and surgeries and things like that. And so that is a very appropriate response, right? Like I mentioned earlier, grieving your expectations, right? I don't think any of us sit here and think one day I'm going to have this diagnosis of breast cancer. And then that happens and you've got to grieve the changes that are coming, right? What you expected your life to be like has changed now. So that's a very, very appropriate response.
What are some tips that you might have for an individual who's been diagnosed with breast cancer and they are having those periods of grief where they just want to be their normal self again, and they just want to be the caregiver that they once were? They want to be the go-getter and the workaholic or whatever role they were playing before they got this diagnosis, whatever their norm was. Like, what suggestions do you have for somebody grieving that? Like, I just want things to be the way that they used to be. I want this holiday to be what it used to be. I want to be the gift wrapper. I want to cook. I want to do the Christmas cards. I want to do all of these different things, but part of me feels gone because of this. What are some tips that you would recommend for somebody kind of experiencing that moment of grief right now?
I think one really important thing is to focus on what you can control, right? You probably are feeling quite out of control. And so focusing on small things that you can control. So maybe you can't cook all day on Thanksgiving Day, but maybe you can bake the desserts ahead of time. And that's something that you are have the energy to do right now. And you can do that. Or, if you can't wrap all the gifts like you used to, you can help pick out the wrapping paper and maybe use that as an experience to teach a child or another family member what you normally do. So focusing on the things that you can control, no matter how small that is. Sometimes with clients who are depressed, like, you can control that you stay hydrated today, right? If that's all we can do, that's all we can do, right? So focusing on things you can control and maybe changing your expectations a little bit. What does new normal look like for me? What are appropriate expectations, right? And setting those expectations that are well within your capabilities and comfort zone so that you don't feel disappointed later. And then making sure that you have something to look forward to, right? So knowing that you may not be able to cook all day Thanksgiving, but you're still going to get to be with your family and eat the Thanksgiving food, right? So kind of structuring it around what you can control and what you can look forward to.
Yeah, I think those are some awesome tips. Like, one of my colleagues told me this week when I was stressing out, she was just like, just focus on doing the next right thing.
Yeah.
Do the next best thing. Don't worry about everything that is to come, that hasn't come, that may not come, to kind of help kind of reel it back into where you are right now. So I think that there is power in knowing that, hey, I can get through this if I just kind of change my perspective a little bit. And in changing perspectives, those diagnosed with the breast cancer, or who have a breast cancer diagnosis, they often have these pools of support and love and family. And, it's very difficult for them as well to see their loved one going through these things and these periods of grief. So what are some tips that you could give to individuals who are a co-survivor? So somebody supporting somebody or who loves somebody with breast cancer. What are some suggestions you would give to them? Hey, I noticed that my mom is going through a moment of grief. She doesn't feel like herself. She feels like her new life is just not what it's supposed to be. What do they say to somebody, when somebody oftentimes, loses a family member or someone close to them? People say, I'm sorry for your loss, or I'm sending my condolences. So, what would be something you would think would be an appropriate response for somebody who loves someone with breast cancer?
Yeah. I actually want to flip that. I will answer that question. But I want to flip that to like what you should not say.
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
This is kind of like one of my like soapboxes. So it really grates under my skin when people do this. And no one is meaning to be like malicious when this happens, but it is, and it is malicious. So not malicious, but it comes across, right? So things like everything happens for a reason, it's all going to work out, those can be very hurtful and very invalidating. That's saying like, what's your experience? That's kind of invalidating your experience, right? You were saying like, this sucks and it's hard and I don't know what I'm going to do. And they're like, oh, it'll all work out. So don't try to avoid saying things like that. It'll all work out. Everything happens for a reason. We also want to be careful when trying to relate to other people. So often if we're meet someone who's going through something, we'll say, well, I had, a cousin who had this, or I've been through this myself. And that can be helpful sometimes when shared appropriately. But we also need to be mindful that we never know exactly the way someone else is feeling, right? Like I could have a twin sister and we could have a diagnosis of the exact same kind on the exact same day, and she and I are still not going to be going through the same thing, right? So acknowledging that we don't know how you feel and that that's okay. So also avoid the suggestions of like, have you tried this diet or this supplement or things like that? That's just really not helpful. If I want your help, I'll ask for that. So I think the best thing that you can say is just to acknowledge, like, I'm sorry. I know this is really hard. Be honest. Tell them I'm here for what you need, right? People may not say that they need anything. So I don't know, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, a text message went viral of a woman who had had a miscarriage, and her friend sent her this list of things like, 1, I'll pick up your kids at this time and feed them dinner, or 2, I can drop off this at your house, or 3, I'll come do this, right? Gave 3 very concrete suggestions and basically was like, pick one. So offering to do those things and meet those needs in very tangible ways are helpful, because you're saying, I will do this. I have the capability to do this. What do you need? And you're taking away that option for them to say, no, I don't need help. And so maybe it is something, just being there with someone so they're not physically alone. Maybe it is dropping off their favorite meal, doing their laundry, getting their kid from school. I was going through a hard time a few years ago, a few years ago. And one of my friends was like, what do you need from the store? Not like, let me drop off a casserole, but like, what are the things that you need? Do you need toothpaste? Like that sort of stuff. And that was really helpful for me. And then I want to kind of wrap that part up with a professor of mine in graduate school always reminded us of the be with attitudes. So I am here. I hear you. I understand. Not I understand how you feel, but just, having that understanding, and that I care. So those are 4 things that anyone really needs to have someone that hears you, that's there for you, that understands and that cares.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think those are some amazing points. And I'm so glad you pointed out what what not to say. And then, because even though, co-survivors might be grieving the changes too, we never want to dump that into the person that's actually going through this journey. We never want to tell them, I'm so sad you're not cooking your sweet potato pie this year. Like, you don't want to make them, feel away. They're already feeling away. Like, you don't want to dump that in. So I think that that is some great advice. And then not knowing what to say is okay too.
Absolutely.
You don't always have to have the advice, because I mean, if you've never had breast cancer, especially, you can't necessarily give them advice on how to deal with it. So I think that that's wonderful that you kind of pointed out, like just being a presence and being of assistance and being tangible to this person will help, especially for those who don't know what to say, and realizing it's okay that you don't know what to say, but, showing love and support, goes a long way for those experiencing this diagnosis, and experiencing this grief that comes along with it.
Yeah, and maybe we just need someone to like sit on the couch and watch a movie and not talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then that's okay.
It doesn't always have to be those dark conversations. Sometimes things that help with grief is just, like you said earlier, controlling the now, changing your expectation, and doing some of those little things that is still normal to you, or just doing things to kind of take your attention off of the what can't happen or what won't happen or what might happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, it's specifically to the holidays, it can be very difficult. In general, the holidays can be a lot. Every holiday, there are new changes coming, especially with the pandemic happening over the past 2 years. Holidays are very different. For some individuals, it might be their first time getting with their family members for the holidays, but now they have breast cancer, so it kind of changes things. I know you mentioned some tips earlier, but what are some specific things that you can kind of identify for those individuals? Like, I can't be around my family because I have this diagnosis now. And I was so excited, I didn't get to be with them last year, and this year I can finally be with them, but I have this breast cancer diagnosis, and they're grieving that. They're grieving, their family, like they feel like they're losing that experience with their family along with, I have this diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, like making sure that you have something that you can look forward to. And again, we may have to change our expectation around that, because probably we were looking forward to seeing our family. And now, because of your treatment plan or because of your medications or for whatever reason you can't travel or whatever, and you can't be with family, what can you do, right? Maybe even starting a new tradition that you can continue. So how to kind of respect and honor that diagnosis or that missing person, but then create new things. I think these types of changes are a good natural time to start something new, right? Was reading this article recently. It's a woman who has like 10 kids. So she's like, we were in the thick of it and we just, went to McDonald's on Christmas Eve. Well, now all of her kids like expect that they're going to have McDonald's on Christmas Eve, and that's their like Christmas Eve tradition. And so, this year you have this new diagnosis and things have changed, and maybe it's time to start something unique and fun. Do you want to watch a movie? Do you want to like make a scrapbook paper turkey? I did that one time for a project. It was really cute. So coming up with something new or different. And then later on, maybe in a few years, be like, hey, remember when I was sick and we couldn't do that, but we did this instead. And that's kind of our really cool, unique holiday experience.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And And also maybe, using the resources that we have gotten during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Like, now we can do things virtually. So maybe if you can't go in person, like maybe have somebody set up a Zoom and you can, watch and talk with everybody that you're not able to see physically all at the same time. Um, I love those tips and I would love to see your turkey.
I don't have the turkey. I mean, I have it somewhere probably, but.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. Are there any other final thoughts that you would love to leave our listeners with? That today's conversation has been, I feel, just really empowering, very insightful. And again, I just think this conversation will help somebody as they're navigating through these different changes. What are some things that you would love to leave our listeners with before we close out?
I kind of want to wrap up with a quote from Jen Hatmaker. You may be familiar with her, but she is kind of a public figure and went through a divorce, and so was kind of grieving that, right? And this is a quote that she posted about her process, and I think it does a really good job of embodying what is grief and how do we move forward. So she said, that is the work, to hold both, denying neither, letting it come when it does. We have loss and we have hope all at the same time. They remain stunningly overlapping, and you don't have to release either.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
I love that quote too. I'm going to have to ping you for that so I can keep that one. But thank you everyone who joined us for our coffee conversation today. I really hope that this information serves you well. And we will see you all again soon.